Every time I want to talk about the Dark Messiah co-op mod progress and just all the great things that's been going on there, I end up making some more progress and thinking to myself, you know, maybe I'll make the video after I finish this part because this part is important. And then that'll keep going, and then we'll go to the next part, and the next part, and then this video gets delayed for 3 months, pretty much. So, you know, I'm gonna cut that out right now, and I'm just gonna make the video. So let's go ahead and do that. If you couldn't tell, I will be talking about the Dark Messiah co-op mod, and namely all the progress that went into fixing the things that I was talking about in the previous video, which I will also give some refresher of, as well as the SDK progress so that more people can make mods and at an easier pace. They don't have to do what I'm doing and reverse engineer the whole damn thing. So, you know, that's what you can expect. So that well, we're gonna see where that takes us, because there's been a lot of progress being done on the thing, and I'm gonna try and keep it short, sweet, but also informative. See what goes on. To start off, and to start strong, one of the biggest, horrible, glaring issues that popped up in our playtesting session was that whenever somebody picked up a prop, it would crash every single other person on the server, even if they couldn't see them pick up the prop. And my original hypothesis was that, you know, this thing was because the prop was trying to parent itself to something that didn't exist, making the assumption that the local player plague was coming back, and that it was trying to set itself to something that, because it's not in a single player game, was never actually initialized, something with the addresses being offset wrong, anything like that. And that was partly correct. But for me to explain that solution, I need to go back and explain how Dark Messiah handles picking up props in the first place, because this was fascinating to me when I discovered it. So, when you look at the code, it's going to look extremely similar to the gravity gun. I had my theories that the gravity gun was being used in some capacity in Dark Messiah because the telekinesis magic ability, I mean, the gravity gun is basically a weaponized telekinesis, so it makes sense, especially when you consider how it functions. Right click to pick up, left click to punt. I mean, it's exactly the same. And that was correct for the telekinesis. When I looked at the code for telekinesis, it was exactly the same. But what I didn't expect was that the hands that hold props normally, your bare hands, are also weapons, and they're also technically gravity guns. That just was absolutely insane to me. Honestly, I gotta give it to Arcane here. That's such a creative solution. And from what I think happens, it essentially mimics the prop that you're picking up, the model of the prop you're picking up, onto the weapon itself, like the view model of it, and then kind of like, it's almost like pretend picking it up. So that means that there's some code in there with how the models are in Dark Messiah that allow it to parent itself to the view model, or at least allow some sort of fake client-side version of that prop to be made, specifically for the view model, and then having the prop version of it disappear. Which is, I think, absolutely just bravo, really. It took me, I think, a month and a half to find that, but once I found that, everything started clicking together. So now that you know that information, let me explain how these things started clicking. When I traced back the address of the function that was causing all the crashes, it actually was not helpful at all. And I'll explain why. You see, it was only 4 lines of code, and the error in it was obvious. It was clearly being passed something that was going to a base address of 0, which is the equivalent of it just not existing. And because it didn't exist, the offset would go to a place it couldn't read, didn't have the rights for it, and it would just kill the whole program. So that makes perfect sense. But knowing what that function was getting did not help me, and knowing where it was going helped me less. Let me explain why there. This is the first time I've dealt with this in the entire development of this mod, but Dark Messiah has this little thing called Securom, and it is a DRM. It's meant to prevent reverse engineering and, you know, just keep the whole program safe, prevent cheats, whatever it is. And, well, when I tried to trace back the function to see maybe where it was coming from, get a little more insight, I was actually greeted with about 1,000 function calls, which I couldn't actually even get through, because at some point, if I kept going, it would just crash Dark Messiah. I don't know why. Usually I'm able to get pretty far with my instructions. I'm assuming Secure ROM must have cut this off somewhere. It's the only thing that makes sense. But the moral is that I am unable to get what that function actually does. So I had to sort of think outside the box on how that was being handled. But one thing that did help was that I had gotten a function previously that it was sort of the overlying function, because it had a bunch of handlers in there. It had things like clamping, which is usually used for velocity, or, you know, even angles can be clamped at some extent. But that was the function I ended up having to use, and thanks to the Gravity Gun revelation, I was actually able to trace that function to the main C-base entity class, which is the class that all entities derive from, and find that it was actually in common with another class, which the Gravity Gun uses, called the Pickup Controller. Now, if you can't tell from the name, the Pickup Controller is essentially the controller for when you pick up entities. So with that information in hand, I could actually sit down and see what arguments were being put through my mystery function, and then make a solution, right? So looking at it, I was able to clearly see, because it was derived from the C-base entity, and the first argument in this case was the class being passed through, that it was an entity as the first argument, 100%. The second argument, it took me a little bit to find, because it required me messing around with the Pickup Controller class and seeing what was going on, but eventually I was able to find that it was indeed a player being passed through. Specifically, it was the local player, which in our case was detoured to be the first player in the server. The solution at that point was pretty simple. I mean, if it was passing the wrong player, just make it pass the right player. And if I just need to get the person from the pickup controller, then why don't I just do that? Which is a pretty good solution if there was any possible way of doing that safely. You see, that function is being used for a bunch of other entities, so I can't just change the one pickup controller part of it without it maybe causing another issue somewhere along the chain. I needed to get the right entity for that function. And, well, since I know it's passing an entity, I just assume that the first argument, well, that must be the entity that's being picked up, because if it's talking about a player as the second one, there's only one thing that would make sense, especially if I looked at the logic and you would check, like, is the first argument the same as the second argument, and if it is, return out. Like, that would only happen if the player's trying to pick up himself, or if the entity's trying to pick up itself, which, no. So, if that's the case, then, well, why don't I just get the picker-upper, whatever, holding entity, that's the right one, from the first entity that's being passed. And super idea. You'd think that would exist, right? Because, like, you'd need to know that information, especially in a video game. You'd want to make sure that the thing that's holding the entity is valid. You wouldn't want to just throw them in there. But no, it doesn't exist, and it hasn't existed until Portal. Portal's the one that added that function in there. So that's good news, because Dark Messiah doesn't have that. So I actually had to write my own function. And after much consultation in the source engine modding Discord, the unfortunate consensus was that the only way to implement such a thing would be to basically loop through every single player, check if they're holding anything, and if they are, check if it's the same thing as the, you know, the entity trying to find its holder. Which is, I guess, I mean, if it's what the only option is, then I suppose that's the implementation that you have to do. So I did. You know what? I goddamn did it. And it worked really, really well, because it actually managed to patch up another issue, which, if you know about in a co-op mod, when an entity actually gets picked up, it sort of floats in front of the player. You can kind of see it in third person. It actually managed to fix all those interactions to be functional in multiplayer, which is great. So this is like a purely such a beautifully permanent solution. But it did raise another issue, where this one was on the server side handling things and networking things. It actually caused an issue on the client side. which is great because this is a huge milestone. It's the first time I've had to edit the client side, which I would have liked to prolong until the quality of life stuff, but honestly, it's good to get this out because then it means that I don't have to sort of reason with myself about whether something is necessary or not on the client side to be done. Now I could just do it because it's already there. But that's a philosophical thing. We're not going to get into that. The actual thing that was messing up was what I think is actually an animation trying to be passed that doesn't exist. Because you're not really in third person in Dark Messiah, so you never have to see the interaction you're doing in there. And it looked as if it was trying to set an animation that didn't exist, or it was trying to set an animation on something that didn't exist, likely the gravity gun equivalent weapon I was talking about when you pick something up with your bare hands. It probably didn't exist in third person, unlike telekinesis, which actually has its own casting thing, because I believe it has some, like the actual weapon model, quote unquote, being the hands. Those are actually something that's used in multiplayer for magic characters. But with that completely commented out, or detoured to the point where it doesn't run, it actually affected absolutely nothing on the client side. Everything still works perfectly fine on the client side, and we don't have that crash in multiplayer. So yeah, that actually fixed everything up really nicely, and it puts us into a state where we can make a lot more drastic changes here without having to worry too much about justifying things, with the client side detours at least. But back to that secure ROM thing for a second, because that actually fixed another issue. When I had tried to figure out what was going on with that function that had 1000 traces, I tried detouring things, and eventually I would find out that the thing it was passing was it was a player. It was going through a player and trying to get some property of the player. And then after looking at the gravity gun and seeing the, I believe, 857 offset, or was it 207? Doesn't matter. Seeing the offset, it was similar to one that was using the gravity gun, and the gravity gun's function was trying to find the use entity. Now, I don't particularly know why that would fix what I'm about to say, because it uses something called the player pickup entity, and that is pretty much bound to the gravity gun one-to-one. I mean, it's the pickup controller, but in entity form. It's bound that way. But by basically passing the first player at all times, I managed to fix this issue where somebody would be trying to pick up an item, but they wouldn't be able to do it unless the host was able to see the item pickup. And that is such a big deal. Despite it being a minor thing, it's such a huge deal because it actually adds this whole quality of life thing in there. Now, we did find that there was some flickering on the little box that appears when you try to pick up the item between the players. And actually, now I think about it, it mostly affected the host. So it isn't that big of a deal. It's absolutely playable, and it may be something I'll look through later on to just stop. But it doesn't cause any crashes. All the functionality is there. All things are picked up, and everything over there is good to go. So that's another good pass on that functionality there. Since I was doing those quality of life update stuff, I continued and I was thinking about, well, what else is broken when you play multiplayer? And that's the fact that, well, a player can't actually change the map when they get to the end of the level. They'll just go into the void because the map trigger does not actually change the map. And this was, like, it was the easiest thing to fix. It was just really hard to find. I actually had to consult again the Source Engine modding Discord. And we was able to find out that the reason why it doesn't change the level is because there's something in the engine binary that prevents the change level command from being run under certain conditions. In my case, it was actually hard-coded to check if the max players was greater than 1, and if it was, it would stop that command from running at all. I don't really know why it would do that, because when I changed that by detouring, or rather patching that byte in the engine binary, I actually managed to be able to play, change the level, and the level change would store all my inventory, my health, any item I was holding, and any items in the change level area which I think is pretty amazing, honestly. I wasn't expecting it to work so well, especially in multiplayer, and especially with all those extra things that Dark Messiah has in there. You know, given that there's a whole, you know, skill thing going on and all sorts of things. But this is another interesting milestone because it actually is another binary that I had to patch. And actually this one, the more I think about it, is a little bit more dangerous because this is actually patching the engine level. I want to avoid patching the engine as much as possible because the engine is actually something that there is no documentation for unless you get access from Valve or you go and do something terrible and get a leak somewhere that somebody put out. But that's, I'm not saying it because I have it, I'm saying it because it might exist and it could get you in a lot of trouble. I'll need to do my research on whether or not I can keep that sort of thing in the mod or if I'm going to have to find a different workaround. But for now, it works pretty damn well. And it is actually in a very, very playable state. Granted, there's a couple of like visual bugs and things like that. There's some quality of life things I need to add, such as getting skill points and actually sharing them with other players instead of just having the host hoard it. But yeah, this was a big one. And I was trying to aim for a Christmas release, but honestly, I think that that's going to get pushed back because, you know, all that momentum is going into something good, and I want to make sure that it is 100% safe, 100% playable, and then work from there. And I think, honestly, I'm going to end the video here. I wanted to talk about the SDK and all that stuff, but I'm going to decide to make that a separate video. And by making it a separate video, that means that it will not take another 4 months, 6 months, whatever I said last time. It was a couple of months, but whatever. It's not going to take that long to make it. Hopefully. In fact, I should probably start recording it after this video just because there's not really any new information that's going in there. It's actually just updating all the stuff that I managed to sort of expose and things like that. But for this video, we're going to stop there. I have been actively talking about this on the Discord. I've been giving some updates on the knockout thread, both of which I will have put in the description by the time of this upload. So you can go and check those out if you want more information. You know, I'm legally obligated by the powers that be to remind you to subscribe if you're not already, because you know, you're not hurting anybody, so you might as well do it. And also, you like the content, I hope. I'm not going to force you to subscribe if you don't like the content, but, you know, who am I to make that decision, right? But, yeah, I apologize for the huge gap, not sitting there doing nothing. It's just that there's a lot of stuff that's being done, and it's just really exciting, and I just, you know, want to make sure that it's coming out right, so that when I show a video, I don't have to say, oh yeah, I take all that stuff back. But yeah, you know, that's it. I hope that you will have or have had a good holiday if you celebrate at all. And if not, you know, I just hope you had a good day. Because, you know, we could use a lot of those these days. Take it easy.